Must every empire have a driving ideology? Does Vladimir Putin's have a coherent vision, from the Russian perspective at least? And does all naked aggression have an intellectual fig leaf as a justification? In short, does his madness have any method at all? Join me, Darasz, for How We Got Here.
This is Putin, Russia's Tsar, president rather. But what is Putinism? Most often it is defined by statism or state patriotism, anti-Westernism and cultural conservatism. Marlene Laurel, Professor of International Affairs and Political Science at George University, suggests that Putinism rests on three core worldviews. First, the fall of the USSR was a treasonous betrayal. Second, Russia should be recognized as a unique great power. And third, the state embodies the Russian nation. Moreover, 5 major strategic narratives stem from these views. Russia as a civilization state, Russia as a force impeding the coming of anarchists, Russia as defender of traditional values, Russia as an anti-fascist power, and Russia as the leading anti-colonial force. None of the above are rooted in reality, but that's what the Russian propaganda submerges its citizens in. According to Mikhail Suslov, author of Putinism, Post-Soviet Russian Regime Ideology, Russians find this ideology attractive because it speaks to their feelings of, quote, injustice, insecurity, national dignity and pride. But what is a totalitarian ideology without the bolstering of political and military acts? Russia has shown several fits of muscle flexing in former Soviet republics. Think of Abkhazia and the South Ossetia wars, the Tajikistan civil war, the 2008 war with Georgia, among other conflicts.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Robert Pszczel. He's a former NATO senior official and he's a senior fellow at the Centre for Eastern Studies. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you for the invitation.
As we were talking before we came on, we were both in the UK in the early 1980s. Margaret Thatcher had Thatcherism, however that was defined. And our clips here seem to say that Putinism was a lot of isms. What exactly is it? Or how would you define it?
Yeah, I mean, if I could avoid it, I wouldn't. In a sense that, it describes much more in terms of, let's call it sort of intellectual prowess and cohesion. To actually, what is a pretty simple idea, which is that, a certain person by the name of Vladimir Putin came to power almost accidentally, to some extent at least, when President Yeltsin, who was democratic elected in the manner that was certainly democratic, but sort of, Soviet Union's and then Russian standards, then the questions asked as well. But he came to power, and then he then started, as he found out that he could stay in that power, and he kind of liked it, which is not completely unusual. And the forces who were, of course, supporting him, and biography says it all, he is, of course, a product of, of the KGB, yes, of the security services. So he and people around him started developing some kind of concepts to justify, stay in power. Because, even if at the beginning one could argue that because, he came to power at the time when Russia was kind of, it was years of chaos, if you like, and there was the Chechen War, which, Yeltsin could not de facto manage, and so he sort of, Putin was seen by the Russians as a sort of safe pair of hands, introduced certain order on a personal level. He was not drinking, at least not visibly. Unlike Yeltsin, yes, he was younger, healthier, sporty, and all the rest of it. So, these were the ingredients which then they sort of started cooking something, right? But in reality, I would argue very strongly that, it's just too much to try to ascribe to the regime whose main goal is to stay in power. It's a self-perpetuation. And it reached the stage, we could see it, although there were other, recently when there was some eavesdropping during the summit with the Chinese leader, what they were talking about on the sidelines. They were talking about cryogenics and various others, methods to essentially prolong life. He wants, remember COVID? He was obsessed with this. So that is, the regime's goal is the regime itself, and therefore the word Putin, of course, Putinism is simply used because it's about him. If he was Ivanov, it would be Ivanov's, regime.
Well,
that's
right.
Is Putin's.
I mean, is this something that the West tends to put, a label that the West tends to use more often than it should? It's kind of have a coherent form, a set of ideas that drives an individual along the way, which, as you seem to suggest, it doesn't.
Well, there are two different things. One is that I think to have his name, the word Putin, if you want to describe the current political system, the sort of, top, bottom, and so on, is justified because it is totalitarian de facto. It's autocratic for sure, but it's also very personalized. Because without Putin, he is actually the linchpin to all this. He is holding the strings, he's kind of managing the clans, he is the adjudicator, he is the face of it. The whole generation of Russians actually do not know any other leader because he's been around for quite so long. So in that sense, it is justified. At the same time, I don't think it's justified when you start speaking about ideology, because, what exactly are those elements in the intro to the program? Quite rightly, it said that various claims that the propagandists, that's what they are, the PR people on steroids. It's an industry, by the way, under Putin. They're making these are not just lame. They have no bearing to reality because for example, he is the standard bearer of conservative values. Really, I mean, apart from his own life, how many he's changed, in terms of his family life, etc. But the whole regime, the people who work for it. I mean, it's one of the most cynical. Totally, contradicting any sort of value. My God, Margaret Thatcherism. There was also a label which I don't think Lady Thatcher liked, but she would literally, go like this if you would hear that somebody would compare conservatism of her era to the conservative, so-called conservative of Putin. So there's a lot of misunderstanding what it's about, and the first thing which comes to mind, my generation, yours as well, I'm sure you also brought up on Monty Python and that sort of era, and we all remember the life of Brian when they'd have a discussion, what have the Roman Empire ever done? Well, and then a serious point is made that, well, actually the aqueducts, yes, and the roads, well, try to come up with any sort of achievements. If you want to talk about Putinism as a sort of, ideology, well, you'd be hard-pressed. I mean, Russia is down the league of any kind of educational standards. There's no Russian university which is even making even one, the first 100 in Europe alone. The state of the roads, hospitals, you name it, even in sports. Now Russia, of course, is banned in most of the sports. Yeah. Soviet Union, it was terrible. It was an autocracy as well, but at least they could make some claims. Hey,
ballet. A coherent view to the rest of the world.
It was kind of madly coherent in the sort of communist, ideological terms up to a point. Although he was also, there was a huge discrepancy between the so-called, ideals or the claims and the reality. But nevertheless, industrialization. There's some things they could at least point to. Was at the first person to space. After Putin is gone, and therefore Putinism. What exactly will people remember? Well,
is it just another iteration of an old style Russian imperial idea about its sense of mission in the world?
Well, maybe
it's had since the probably late 18th century at least.
It's an interesting question. I kind of pondered it myself, including 5 years I spent in Moscow as a head of the NATO office there. It's strange because the people most likely to ascribe to that view, one would think would be the sort of the old guard. The people who are nostalgic about this, and there's fewer and fewer of them because, generation gap. But to be very frank, those people I found in Russia who were still at least close to power of sorts, right, different positions, they were probably even more cynical than the others. They did not believe any of that sort of Putin's propaganda, even if they were either participating
in the religious aspect of it.
Because they'd seen it all. They know the lies, they live for too long and so on. So they kind of shrugged and said, okay, well, this is the new narrative today, fine, whatever. As long as I can keep my job or, I can be capitalist. I've met a chap, for example, who is a director of a big institute, and he said, well, I actually like the West, and, I'm a sort of a capitalist in a sense, and, I like all this trade and so on. And then he proudly showed me, I'm also a member of the Communist Party. I said, really? Well, how does it do? And then he showed me the icon, so he's also religion. How the hell do you square all this? You don't. Because, that's one thing which we must remember, that Russia today, the Russian society, including people at the top, there's literally, what's within their brains is, it's a traumatized society. So there are people even who believe that they are doing this to the others. They control the narrative, but their set of views and opinions and understanding of the world is completely really far away from reality. Sometimes it can be said it's 19th century, 18th century. I don't know. If you start talking about imperialism, for example, but this mission thing. I don't think even the people within the regime actually believe it, and then you only have to look at the lifestyle of the people who kind of made it. Do they really want to stay and sort of enjoy the status of being driven, in a sort of troika through the streets of Moscow? No, they want to stay in Saint-Tropez or in Florida, and so on. So there's incredible amounts of hypocrisy, and that's the best, in my view, illustration of the fact that this is fake. This is it's a fake ideology, if you like. It is about power. It is about a desire to perpetuate because it's an incredible amounts of amassed wealth. These are not, this is big. This is what sort of attracts autocrats to autocrats, by the way. They like this sort of thing.
We'll take a look at our next clip, which will translate this idea of the hypocrisy of power into its territorial ramifications.
According to a 1999 survey of key determinants of great power status, 64% of Russians noted economic prosperity, while 63% also said high living standards. However, since Russia's economic reforms fizzled out, the only compensation the Kremlin could offer was foreign policy achievements, such as the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Following the land grab, and for the first time since 1991, the number of respondents seeing their country as a great power exceeded 65%. There's also something organic about Russia's post-imperial quest to reclaim its lost glory. Just like when a human being can't stand the limitations of his or her own body and seeks alternative methods of advancement, Putinism-ridden Russia is terrified of restrictions on its territory and empire. Territorial grievances play a noticeable part in the social appeal of Putinism. The ideology brought about a shift within the narrative of Russia as a great power. Away with the concept of Russia as a territorially fixed entity, in with a notion of historical Russia. The fall of the USSR is the chip on the shoulder of both Putin and Russians in general.
It was a disintegration of historical Russia under the name of the Soviet Union.
In addition to the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in Ukraine, the Kremlin has been waging a new campaign of revisionism with a state-approved history textbook titled Russia New History. The text caters to Russians' feeling of injustice, insecurity, national dignity and pride. It would seem that Moscow is dreaming about bringing back the USSR, which has become fetishized as its peak accomplishment.
The idea of the loss of the USSR, is that a luxury belief that the Russian elites have? Or the people we saw at the beginning of the clip freezing in their coats during the winter. That seems to be a very distanced thing to believe, or does it actually resonate down to that level, this loss of the great USSR empire?
Well, I think, one could make a claim as, and scrutinize this idea in terms of what the people in what became, as a successor of the Soviet Union, because after all, various parts of the Soviet Union are no longer part of the Russian Federation, but it still is. This is unlike, by the way, sorry for this sort of digression, but unlike, Great Britain or France or Portugal, Spain, who had empire. Russia is an empire. Even today's Russia is a sort of empire because, of course, it's composed of various nations who never wanted to be part, Chechens, for example. So Putin doesn't even understand that, frankly, because he's a poor historian. We know he's a poor military strategist and various other things. He's not as good as he thinks, but he's a really poor historian because if he tries to claim that, Soviet Union was basically just, a form of a former Russian empire, well, then Stalin himself was Georgian, for goodness sake. A lot of Soviet leaders were not Russian, and Soviet Union was something much bigger, so he doesn't get it. But to come back to the original point, if you were talking about 1990s, yes, it was quite a traumatic time. So if you were a Russian, you felt, my God, the world has kind of collapsed. The standard of living has sort of, there was chaos, money was worth that much. There's a lot of people making themselves filthy rich before it was supposed to be egalitarian. It wasn't, but at least the difference was not that huge. So there was kind of like longing for some kind of stability. And in those, and the Soviet Union, I remember 1990s, there were opinion polls when they were asked who was your favorite leader. It was not Ivan the Terrible or Catherine the Great or Peter the Great or even Stalin. It was Brezhnev, because people just longed for, the sort of boring stability which they could remember. So that was to some extent explicable. But what followed, the deal which Putin offered, and he was lucky because he came to power when the price of what is still the main Russian product. Russia does not really export that much apart from energy and natural resources. The prices were good, much better than during Yeltsin. So he could offer something which not only benefited himself and his clique, but sort of ordinary people. But of course, it never lasted very long because these things do not last if you don't invest and if you don't produce a system which can actually make the country prosper and develop. All you do, you just look after sort of your own. So in that sense, I think it's, all the issues connected to whether it's territory, whether it's sort of, post-Imperial, trauma. There's a much more figments of the imagination, and they are attempts to justify the policies which are aimed to, again, staying in power, because, Putin rules by two not very original levers. One is bribery, sorts, the immediate entourage. Yeltsin's immediate entourage was probably about 200 people. Putin, you're talking about thousands, right? And the second is fear. And when you've got not that much to offer in terms of corruption and financial inducements, including those things which are left for the general public, then you resort much more to fear. And if you want to resort to fear, you have to justify the expenses which go on military, security, etc. And that usually is, we are surrounded by enemies, which is, of course, a very old, by the way, Soviet standard, and to some extent also the Russian concept.
Went in phases of being Western, closer to the West, and then distance from the West, and they throughout their history. What are the implications for countries like the Baltic states and Poland for this paranoia? You say that they just want to. Can they keep within their borders? I suppose is the question.
Well, this is part of the problem. If Russia is for many reasons, one could justify the term. It's a sort of a failed state. I mean, it has not really produced, has not developed this. If one looks at, it has a lot of neighbors because it's still the largest country on planet Earth. Which country can actually be considered a sort of a real friend of Russia? Which you can say Belarus, but that's, mainly because of the client relationship. And then you have all these countries which used to be part of whatever, CIS and, collective security treaty, etc. Well, it's a strange kind of, by the way, security treaty organization in which the members are more afraid of their ally than they are of any kind of imagined, enemy from outside. The relation with China, that's no longer, obviously, a partnership. It's very one-sided because that's the difference. So, it is a problem because Russia is, this regime is actually thriving. It's made particularly after, it's like from an animal kingdom, it smelled blood. It's become a predatory regime. And the moment it started using first, of course, internal in Chechnya, and then Georgia was a big turning point. They used the military force. Then Syria, now of course Ukraine, now therefore, and that means that the regime is kind of turned towards war, which is not uncommon in the history of Russia, as it's kind of business. If you're living in today's Russia, you have the misfortune, I would argue, then you can only be sure that, the biggest chances that you'll be able to make some money, essentially, if it has something to do with the war. Whether it's raw materials, whether it's certain elements of production, whether it's propaganda, you can make a lot of money and so on. But it's to do with war. It's with plunder. It's not really, the Russia, what they still dreamed, it could be a big powerhouse when it comes to, IT, for example. There were some good companies. It's not devoid of brainy people. Most of them, they have emigrated. So this is the tragedy, and that has obviously implications for the neighboring countries because they know that it's in the logic of the regime to search for confrontation to justify the sacrifices it demands at home. To
coalesce the domestic front. A final short question to you, Mr. Pszczel. Once Putin goes, Putinism goes, but surely they're the ghosts of this mentality of being in power and staying in power are just going to morph into another dictatorship?
This is a very serious question, which deserves, in my view, a very serious but also very firm answer. People like myself, I'm not alone, certainly, giving a lot of thought to this because there is a very dangerous myth sometimes being articulated, which is that, be careful what you wish for because if Putin goes, that somebody comes after him might be worse. Well, it might be, but, first of all, we know who we're dealing with. Putin is a disaster and he should go for the benefit of the rest of the world and of the Russians themselves. Does it mean that Russia will immediately become a better place? Absolutely not. First of all, it will have to deal with Putin's legacy. And the problem is, right now, one does not see the forces, including democratic opposition outside, which are doing something about it. So it will have to go for a lot of convulsions. But Putin being gone from the system will be the first opportunity to actually change Russia for the better.
Robert Pszczel, thank you very much indeed for coming onto our programme. We must leave it there, unfortunately.
My pleasure.
Great conversation. So that's it. Join us next time for How We Got Here. That's Tuesdays, 21:35, 9:35 p.m. CET. Join us then and don't be late.